All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Shelley Gregory with Forge. My pronouns are they, them, or any pronoun. And we're gathering tonight to talk about planning your vote in Wisconsin for the November 2020 election. So here we are. So we talked about election protection, and we talked about my vote, wisconsin.gov. So, we all know that there are some issues that certain populations face, challenges that we may face in voting in person in particular. So I just want to talk about a few of those challenges today that we might anticipate and how we can plan to deal with them. So again, voter ID law in Wisconsin. We have to show that photo ID when we vote. Our address does not have to be correct. It's okay if you've moved, if the address is wrong. When we're presenting photo ID at the polls, the poll worker, again, is really looking to make sure that we have ID in the name that matches the poll book, the poll record. Now, it's certainly possible that many of us, our identity, our expression, our presentation, may not align real closely with what is on our photo ID. And that can be the case for anybody, right? Like, that's not an issue that only affects trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming voters. People lose weight, gain weight, change hairstyles, may or may not be wearing makeup. There are lots of reasons that people may not look exactly like they do in their photo IDs. The poll workers know this. They are trained not to focus inordinately on how similar the person appears to the photo ID. What the law requires in Wisconsin is that the poll worker check that the photo reasonably resembles the voter who is presenting it. That does not mean that they are to be scrutinizing that photo, and they should not be giving people a hard time about gender identity and how we may look different from what's in that photo. We'll talk about what we can do if that happens. Again, if you don't have an ID and you need one, you can go to wisconsindot.gov. That's the DMV's website, and there is a form on there to request request an ID that is simply for the purposes of voting. So that's one thing we can do if we need to get an ID. If we show up at the polls, we present our ID, and it is scrutinized by the poll worker, and they are questioning whether we're the person depicted on the photo ID. What can we do? There's a couple of different things we can do. We're going to talk in a minute about where to get help at a polling location if we need it. Ultimately, if we are told that our photo ID is not acceptable, what the poll workers are supposed to do is offer the opportunity to cast a provisional ballot. What that means is that you're given a ballot, you fill it out, and the ballot is collected. The ballot, however, will not be counted unless you follow up. And you need to follow up by Friday following the election. And what you need to do is follow up at your clerk's office and produce an ID that they consider acceptable. My advice is that if for some reason you are told that your ID is not acceptable, I would ask for a provisional ballot, and I would ask for them to tell you what the follow-up instructions are, and I would cast that provisional ballot. That's going to be your best chance at that point of having your votes counted. And what you need to do at that point then is figure out how you can comply with the voter ID requirements by Friday. The other thing that does is give you some time to seek some assistance if you need it, if you think that the poll worker has made a mistake, or if you need help getting some ID or figuring out what you can use to make sure that ballot gets counted. Some other issues, again, that we may encounter at the polls. It's really, really, really important for all of us to be aware and know that folks who have prior convictions for felonies, that their rights to vote are automatically restored in the state of Wisconsin. Again, that's not true in all states. In some states, the person with the conviction has to go through a process to get their right to vote restored. That is not the case in Wisconsin. Folks' right to vote is automatically restored. Folks have to be what is called off papers. That's the term that people use. And what that means is, you have the conviction, but you have, number one, fully served your sentence, and number two, you have completed any probation or parole or extended supervision period that you were on. So at that point, when you've completed all of that, you are what's called off papers. And at that point, your right to vote is restored. Now, folks with felony convictions do get removed from the voter rolls at the time of their conviction. So somebody with a conviction does need to re-register. And so that's one important thing to remember, and that obviously that's got to be done in advance of the election, unless the person wants to do same-day registration at the polls. Accessibility of polling sites. This is something that we know is an issue in Wisconsin. All polling sites are to be accessible in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so that means not only physical accessibility in terms of being able to get through the door, not having stairs as barriers, not having other physical impediments to accessing the site, but also the actual act of voting is to be accessible. There are a few different ways that polling sites deal with accessibility issues. We know, the state of Wisconsin knows, and folks who do voting work know that many of our sites are not accessible, which is not acceptable. As a result, the state uses something called curbside voting. If a voter has a disability or has a need for assistance even in literally marking their ballot, they can have that assistance. Curbside voting literally means pulling up in a car in front of the polling station, letting the poll workers know that there is a voter present who needs to use curbside voting. And the way we can do that is, there's two different ways to do that. One, call ahead. I recommend that you call ahead to your polling site, let them know that you're coming or that someone is coming who's going to have a need for curbside voting, just so that they know to expect that. The other thing you can do is when you get to the poll, if you yourself can't go inside and let the poll workers know that you're there, if you've got a friend or somebody driving you, they can go inside and do that. There also tends to be a lot of people outside polling places, and you can simply ask somebody to go inside and let the poll workers know that there is a request for curbside voting. What happens then is that the poll workers come out to you, and they bring their poll book with them. And they'll go through the same process with you while you are in your vehicle as they go through with folks who are inside. You'll have to show your ID, you'll have to sign the poll book, and then you'll mark your ballot, and you'll do all of that right inside your car. And they'll take everything back inside and make sure that the ballot gets fed into the machine. So that's curbside voting. If folks have a need for assistance in marking their ballot, whether it's because of sight impairment or some other reason, you can have assistance marking your ballot. You need to tell the poll worker that when you're inside or at the curb, and then that person can go with you and help you mark the ballot, okay? Harassment, discrimination, if there are various things that can happen. Some happen inadvertently. If you're being asked a lot of questions about your photo ID, if you're being asked questions that are not appropriate about your gender identity because you don't look as much like the photo that's in on your photo ID anymore, you cannot be harassed about that, and you cannot be discriminated against, and you cannot be told that you can't vote. If you encounter any problems inside the polling place or outside the polling place, in terms of people impeding your ability to get inside, what you need to do, and what my recommendation is to first seek help at the polling station. You want to get help, if you can, from the person who is the chief inspector. The chief election inspector is the person who has ultimate responsibility for the polling site. They are overseeing the whole voting process, and they are supervising the poll workers. And the poll workers follow their directions. If you have any problems voting, I suggest that you ask to speak to the chief election inspector. If the chief election inspector is not available, if you don't get the help you need from them, or if you just don't want to ask to speak to them, I would take a look around the polling site and look for folks who are either there observing the election on behalf of the political parties or on behalf of nonpartisan entities like the League of Women Voters. And I would talk to those election observers and let them know that you're having a problem. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, who these folks are and how you can identify them and get some help from them. In terms of voter ID and preparing to deal with some of these issues, I really want to recommend the National Center for Transgender Equality's website. They've got a great page on voting rights, and it talks about all of these issues, and there's a checklist there for trans voters to take a look at, make sure that we're prepared as well as we can be when we go to our polling locations. They've got these really great handouts that they put out. This is a two-page handout, and it's available in English and in Spanish. If you anticipate having any challenges, or if you're just interested in helping educate the poll workers at your polling place, I would definitely consider printing out this handout. The first page of it, it has advice for trans and non-binary voters, and talks about what our rights are in terms of photo ID and voting. The second page has information specifically for poll workers. NCTE suggests, and I agree, if you anticipate having some challenges, print this out, take it with you, and you can hand this to the poll worker. If you're having any issues, or if you think they need a little education about voter ID and folks who might be gender non-conforming.